Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, a community that continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society. Tonight, I'm pleased to host Woody Holton to talk about his new book, Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. I'm also joined by AAS Director of Outreach, Kayla Hopper. For newcomers here this evening, I'd like to introduce the Society briefly. The American Antiquarian Society was founded in 1812 by printer Isaiah Thomas. We are a research library and learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're devoted to understanding and sharing the history and culture of North America before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and make accessible the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts, more than 4 million objects in all. In addition to this virtual program that you're attending tonight, we have a variety of other virtual public programs. We offer visiting research fellowships, and we welcome scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room to work on their own research projects. I'm delighted to say that we're once again welcoming readers by appointment. We also, through our website, have access to the catalog of the materials here at AAS, and some of those materials are available digitally through the website. We're delighted to present programs like this one tonight free of charge, though of course running such programs isn't without expense. If you wish to help support programs like this one, a link to AAS's giving page is available in the chat. Now, Kayla will offer a quick overview on the platform we're using for tonight's program. Over to you, Kayla.
Thanks, Scott, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here with us tonight. Just a few notes about the different functions that we'll be using in Zoom tonight. For the Q&A portion at the end of the program, we'll be using the dedicated Q&A function, not the chat box. By using the Q&A function, we're better able to keep track of questions, and it has an upvote function. So if someone posts a question that you want to see discussed, be sure to upvote it to get it to the top of the queue. You can place your questions into the Q&A function at any point during the program. Due to the large number of attendees, the chat box will be used only for informational purposes. So throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and information there, and you can contact us as presenters if there's any technical difficulties that we need to know about. If you want to save the chat to retain the links for future use, you can save a transcription of it by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat window. Closed captioning is also available as an option for tonight's program via Zoom's live transcription function. You can turn the closed captioning on and off with the button labeled CC. Finally, we are recording this program and it will be available on our website and YouTube channel for viewing later. And that's it. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Kayla. Now it's a delight to introduce Woody Holton, the McCausland Professor of History at the University of South Carolina. He's the author of 4 books. His first one, called Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia, won the Merle Curti Prize of the Organization of American Historians. Woody's second book, Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution, was a finalist for both the George Washington Book Prize and the National Book Award. And his third, Abigail Adams, won the Bancroft Prize, one of the most prestigious awards for any book in the field of history. I'm happy to mention also that Woody was an NEH Fellow here at the American Antiquarian Society back in 1999-2000, among his many fellowships that include also support from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. His new book, Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution, appeared last month, and it's the topic of our conversation tonight. Woody, welcome.
Thank you very much, Scott. I'm really glad to be here.
It's great to see you. Let's get right into it. Liberty is Sweet is a narrative history of the American Revolutionary era. It begins in 1763, it ends in the 1790s. Most of the chapters cover just a year or part of a year so that a reader really moves through the period as the events occurred. As I was reading it, I noticed some of those events, the Stamp Act crisis, the Battle of Bunker Hill, the writing of the Declaration of Independence, and more, will be familiar to readers who've taken an American history course as far back as elementary school or high school. Other things in the book won't be so familiar. What's the hidden history here, and how might it help us rethink what we thought we already knew?
Well, I really appreciate that question, because one thing I'd say is that some of the events that are familiar, like the Stamp Act, have an unfamiliar side that I want to talk about. And actually, I'm going to swipe the screen from you to show you a very cool map. I bet you AAS has a copy of this cantonment of British forces in North America, because what I want to say about the hidden history is, or to start off with, that Native Americans played a really crucial role in whites' decision to declare independence. And a lot of people watching tonight will be familiar with part of that, which is that in 1763, Native nations as far out as Fort Michilimackinac out here gathered together more than a dozen nations in what was called Pontiac's Rebellion and attacked the colonists. And in response to that, the British drew this line that I'm running my cursor along, the Appalachian Mountains, the proclamation line of 1763, saying, don't take any more land from the Indians, not out of any kindness, but to prevent another expensive war with them. But here's my point, is that a lot of people know about the proclamation line. What they don't know is that people in the colonies like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, who really wanted to multiply their wealth by speculating in Indian land, asked the British to repeal the proclamation line. And the British said no because of people represented by the blue star here. And that is the female peace chiefs living along the Wabash River started an effort in 1769 to revive the Pontiac coalition and attack the colonists. And British officials found out about that, and again, didn't want to get into a war with the Indians. And so they stuck by the proclamation line, and only the Revolutionary War nullified it. So there's an area that people have kind of been, have kind of known that Native Americans were behind the proclamation line. But here's another role that they played that is much less familiar, and that is one of the topics you mentioned, the Stamp Act. If you read the Stamp Act, the Parliament makes it clear that all the money raised was supposed to go to funding 10,000 troops to be left in America in 1763 after the war against the French that people call the French and Indian War. And you can actually see them. That's what this map represents, the red dots, for instance, at Detroit and Fort Pitt, which is now Pittsburgh, of course, as far out as Fort Sharp. These are British troops, 10,000 of them, mostly to be left on the border to, as the annual register said, awe and protect the Indians. And I really like that phrase, awe and protect, because on the one hand, they're there to protect the colonists from indigenous people. On the other hand, they're there to protect indigenous people from the colonists. So you could really call them peacekeeping troops. But like any troops, they're expensive. And so Parliament thought it was reasonable, if we're going to have this human wall of troops on the western border, then it's fair to make the colonists pay for it. And that's the Stamp Act. And so I'd go so far as to say, had there been no Indians, there might not have been a Stamp Act. And if I can show you one other, a couple other slides, I'd say the same thing about African Americans, that we know that a fifth of the British colonists were enslaved by the others, and that they were powerfully affected by the war, but they also helped bring about the white decision to declare independence in July of 1776, because of all people, Abigail Adams in Boston in September 1774 was the first to notice that a group of enslaved Bostonians had collectively petitioned Thomas Gage, the British commander-in-chief, who was also the governor of Massachusetts, saying, give us muskets, put us to work, promise us our freedom, and we'll fight for the British in this war against your colonists. And that was way back in September of 1774, but over the next year or so, all over the 13 colonies, African Americans made overtures like that to the British. And finally, at the end of that period, in November 1775, Governor Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia, accepted that overture from African Americans and issued this Emancipation Proclamation that has a lot in common with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, an offer of freedom to slaves in return for fighting for the British. And I mentioned in the context of your question, Scott, because that document you see on the right there infuriated white Southerners. And they already had plenty to be mad at the British about, but what pushed many over the edge to that final step of declaring independence was, as one Virginian put it, aiming a dagger at our throats through the hands of our slaves. And some people question, okay, you've got a few quotes, but is there really a lot of evidence? And I'm going to use this to plug my on my Twitter page. If you go to Twitter and just search for Countdown to 1619, I've put up 76 quotations from white Virginians, from Thomas Paine to George Washington to Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, talking about their anger at the British for it's an informal alliance with enslaved people, and many of them saying, and that's enough to make me favor independence. So those are just a couple of groups, Native Americans and African Americans, who I think played an unheralded role, but an important one, in the decision of whites to declare independence.
It's a great example. I just want to follow up on that. To what degree is it that the white Virginians and white Bostonians and others are angry at what the British are doing to try to bring enslaved African Americans into the fold? And to what extent is it about the African Americans' own actions to take them up on it?
Well, I'm really glad you asked about the African Americans' own actions, because the Declaration of Independence, here's kind of a nervy thing to say, really gets this wrong. What the capstone grievance in the Declaration of Independence says is, and it's referring to the king, he has excited domestic insurrection amongst us. A clear implication that the king, through his governor, like Governor Dunmore, and other governors did it more on the QT, but what the British officials are doing is stirring up our slaves, who were perfectly happy to be our slaves until the British came along and agitated them. But the chronology that I just gave you shows that that's not what happened. That is, more than a year before the British issued their emancipation, the first of their emancipation proclamations, both Abigail Adams and James Madison in Virginia, there were even reports of this as far away as London, African Americans kept holding their hands out, proffering their services to the British, and were turned away. At one point, Governor Dunmore in May of 75 said, if you come back, I'll have you whipped. But they kept coming. They kept coming and eventually proved their usefulness to the British and were taken on in what Governor Dunmore called his Ethiopian regiment. So yes, if I could sneak in with into the National Archives and make a few edits to the Declaration of Independence, there's a lot of things I wouldn't change, like all men are created equal. But one thing I would change is the British. He has excited domestic insurrection amongst us. Really should be, we're really mad at the slaves for inciting the British against us.
Yeah. So in some ways, the enslaved people are pushing Dunmore's hand as opposed to the opposite way around. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Part of the lead up to the Revolutionary War, you make the point that the fundamental change wasn't coming from the colonists. It was coming from Parliament.
Yes. Yes. I would describe the rebellion from 1763 all the way up until 1774 as Parliament's rebellion against the status quo, because most white colonists were very satisfied with their relationship with the British as of 1762. It was Parliament that was mad about the colonists taking Indian land and thereby stirring up wars against the Indians, it's kind of like your little brother gets into a fight that you got to go get him out of. The colonists provoked these wars that the British government had to pay to put down. And so it's Parliament who wants to change the swiping of Indian land. Again, not out of any compassion for the Indians, but out of not wanting to spend money. And so it's Parliament who tries to change things by the Proclamation Line of 1763. If we wanted to focus more on New England, we would talk about Parliament being angry at the colonists for successfully smuggling in French and Spanish molasses from sugar islands like Cuba and Saint-Domingue, the future Haiti. The colonists were pretty happy. Yes, they weren't supposed to bring in that molasses, but the customs officials were eminently bribable in Boston and Providence. And so they were satisfied. It was Parliament that rebelled against that status quo with the so-called Sugar Act of 64. And likewise, taxation. As I say, it was Parliament that wanted to change things by taxing the colonists, in this case, to pay for those peacekeeping troops trying to keep the Indians and the colonists apart. And so it's really late in the game before the colonists start talking about what they wanted, because all the colonists wanted until 1774 was just to go back to the way things had been before.
Yeah. And as we get to the war itself, as I was reading the book, I was struck by just how much of the book is military history, narration of battles, military movements, which might appear to be the most traditional of historical genres. By my count, roughly 300 pages of the book is really a history of the war. I imagine that one of your challenges in writing this would be, how do you tell the war in a different way and not just add African Americans, Native Americans, and women and stir, the way a lot of textbooks will have just sidebars on the role of Native Americans or the role of women, but really change it. How did you make military history into something different?
Well, sidebar is a great way to put it, and probably better than add and stir, because they often don't stir. That is, right. They are sufficiently set aside. Oh, of course, we have a chapter about blacks, we have a chapter about women, and so forth. And that's why it was so important for me to do this thing, not as chapters on groups, but as an integrated narrative. And I think that's not only a principle, an American principle, I think, since we're such a diverse nation, but it's also faithful to the facts. That is, that you can't really understand. Oh, here, let me swipe the screen again, and I'll give you an example. You can't understand how this war turned out the way it did if you're not following what, for instance, African Americans are doing. So let me go forward a couple of slides here to the Battle of Savannah. The British wanted to take Savannah, Georgia, December 29th, 1778. That's their guy, Campbell. But his American opponent protecting Savannah, named General Howe, not to be confused with the British General Howe. Anyway, Howe has really anchored his flanks well in the rice swamps. And so Campbell climbs a tree, sees how well secured the Americans are, and thinks, oh my God, I'm going to have to do a frontal assault. And that's going to be Bunker Hill type casualties. That is, whenever you do a frontal assault, you can expect 50% casualties. And he's reconciling himself to that. He kind of gets a tap on the shoulder from Kwame Nadali, who is an enslaved man, who says, I know a secret path through the swamp. And sure enough, Campbell sent his men along the line that I'm tracing here, some of his crack troops, who attacked the Americans from behind, creating total disorder, and ended up, Campbell captured Savannah without losing hardly a man. And so African Americans played a really crucial role in the Battle of Savannah. And so if you don't include Kwame Nadali, you don't understand how Campbell succeeded so successfully there. And just to mention one other example, in the I want to take you to 1781, July 9th, 1781, not too far from where you and I were both born in Virginia, but we're at Jamestown. And Lafayette, in his first independent command, is shadowing Cornwallis along the James River. And then Cornwallis decides to cross from the north side of the James River to the south side. And an African-American man visits Lafayette's camp and on the night of July 8th and says, most of Cornwallis's army has already crossed the river. If you attack now, you'll have a temporary numerical advantage and you can wipe out that part of Cornwallis's army, have a nice little victory. And Lafayette gets all excited to attack the British near Jamestown. But then another black man comes up and says, don't believe that other guy. The reality is that almost none of Cornwallis's army has crossed to the other side of the river. He left most of it right here on the north side in order to ambush you. And so Lafayette's decision on July 9th came down to, which African-American man do I believe? He chose to believe the one who said there weren't many British troops in front of him. He charged ahead and suffered a terrible defeat in his only major battle that where he commanded American troops. And so once again, he picked the wrong guy to believe, but Lafayette will tell you more than anybody how crucial African Americans were to his decision. Both halves of his decision relied on black evidence.
And he himself was an abolitionist, or became one at some point in his life.
He sure did.
Yeah. Well, actually, what the example you just described says something about this proclivity to frontal attacks. I mean, when I learned the story of the American Revolution back in high school, probably when I first taught it almost 30 years ago, the story of the war was still very much about the plucky colonial underdogs facing the greatest military on earth. But you actually suggest the opposite. And you mentioned, at least by their own reckoning, the British must be considered the underdogs. The British seem to have understood much earlier than George Washington did how the colonials could win the war, not by attacking frontally, but by doing the kinds of surreptitious attacks and so on. Why did it take Washington so long to figure out what the British General Howe and other British commanders perceived from the very beginning?
I appreciate that question, because I'd say my biggest surprise as I researched this book, I hadn't intended to do a ton of military history. I published with a commercial author, Simon & Schuster, so I knew there would have to be some because readers would want that. But then as I started to give them enough to appease them, I got totally excited about it myself. And my biggest surprise was right there at the beginning, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which I've got a modern depiction of here, because the hero of that battle was a different General Howe. This is the British General William Howe. He captured the hill. Hooray for him by the 18th century standards. This is a great triumph for him. But he suffered 50% casualties on the way up that hill. And he wrote 3 days after becoming this great victor of this battle, General Howe wrote home saying, we're going to lose this war. There's no way for us to win this war because, yes, we captured that hill, but what did the Americans do as we moved into their redoubt at the top of the hill? They ran down the hill and went up the next hill and are waiting for us there, Prospect Hill, just off the Charlestown Peninsula. And this is a country of hills. There was a real fear in Britain of American geography. Of course, there's lots of mountains in parts of Britain as well, but these British officers, they were used to fighting in the well-named Low Countries, places like the Netherlands, and they had the geographic problem that Americans could always retreat to the next hill, and B, the British had the problem of they were stuck on offense. That is, if nothing happens, then they lose because the colonists are in charge and just continue living their lives. The British had to win, or felt at least that they had to win a victory, and they would win these victories, but then the Americans would just withdraw and then charge them 50% casualties for the next hill. And then as the British army moved on, then the Americans would move into the place that they'd abandoned. And as one person at the time said, it was like a ship charging through the water. The wake doesn't last very long and you never know the ship was even there. The British army in many ways was like that. So I think that, and a lot of historians have drawn the analogy to the US experience in Vietnam, that the British were the ones who really never had a chance of winning the war. And then you asked, the harder question is, why couldn't George Washington, who had served with the British Army himself, why couldn't he figure that out? the short answer just occurred to me, which is because he didn't have a Bunker Hill. It took him a while before he had his own first Bunker Hill. The Americans tried a frontal assault at Stono Ferry in 1779, and later in 1779 at Savannah, and failed miserably in both cases. So those, he wasn't present for either of those battles, but those helped educate him. But the bigger thing was precisely that he had spent so much time, the British officer had yearned for a commission in the British Army. And to use a term that a lot of other historians are using in creative ways, masculinity. He thought you could only win a battle by winning a battle, not by attrition, not by wearing the enemy out. There was the example of the Roman general Fabius, but Washington just could not think of being Fabius. He also had tremendous pressure from politicians. Then as now, there were a lot of congressmen who thought they were better generals than the generals, and they were saying, come on, just go ahead and win this. Washington called them chimney corner heroes, which is his version of our Monday morning quarterbacks. He's like, oh, come on, you can just do this. But to his great credit, after a near disaster at Boston, where Washington wanted to attack Boston amphibiously, that at the time, Boston was basically an island, so it was going to have to be an amphibious assault. And there's all this mud along the water that the soldiers would have been slogging through, and meanwhile being shot down with grape shot, which is like a giant cannon. It would have been a disaster. And Washington himself acknowledged that after the British left voluntarily from Boston. He toured the city and saw that they were prepared for house-to-house fighting, almost impregnable, he said. And so that is where he finally started to learn the lesson that we're not going to win this war by going on offense. But let me say one more thing about that. He started to learn this lesson because the British captured New York City, another island, on September 15th of 1776. And Washington immediately started planning amphibious assaults on Manhattan Island. And he came up with about a dozen of them, but never carried any of them out. And he would get really close. I mean, he had the guys in the boats ready to row over to Manhattan, and then he'd come up with some reason for canceling it. And that, to me, was Washington's greatest contribution to the American victory, was restraining himself and not doing what he just felt this impulsion to do. Felt impelled to do.
Yeah. And you mentioned at one point also that one of his other contributions is getting his troops inoculated for smallpox. That's a critical piece of it as well. Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned, we've talked about some of the key places of the Revolution. Mentioned Boston and Bunker Hill, New York, Savannah, Yorktown. Before reading your book, I never before thought of Detroit as a significant theater of the American Revolution.
You're going to make me steal your screen again, because this is worth talking about. The Native Americans played a really crucial role in getting the war started, as I talked about, but they also played a really crucial role once it got going. And you can really see that by just looking at the map of Detroit. Let's see if I can get to it. And if I can't, I won't worry about it. Oh, I'm still sharing, aren't I? Sorry.
That's yes, you're sharing. Yep.
My bad. I got to go back to Detroit. That's of course represented by the blue star there. That now some Native Americans fought on the American side. Most tried to stay neutral, but often got forced to pick sides, and those who did mostly sided with the British. And Detroit was really the armory of the Native Americans in the West, supplying them with guns and ammunition that they used to really keep the colonists in the western parts of Pennsylvania and New York and Virginia and the Carolinas. They really kept the colonists back on their heels throughout the war. And so it made sense that at the same time that Washington was coming up with a dozen plans to capture New York City, never executed, people in the West, with help from Washington and other generals, were planning to capture Detroit. There's a famous letter where Jefferson sends George Rogers Clark out to try to capture Detroit. And it's where he first used that phrase that is famous as one of his most famous, other than the Declaration of Independence, we're going to build an empire of liberty. America is going to be an empire of liberty. Now, he actually stole that phrase from a Philadelphia woman named Esther DeBert Reed, who used it in a pamphlet advocating women going door to door to raise money for the troops. But he gets credit for it in that letter he wrote. And I want to focus now on what he was trying to do, which was capture Detroit, because they figured that's the way to stop the Indian attacks, is to cut off their supplies of weapons. And so there were about a dozen efforts to capture Detroit, none of which got anywhere near Detroit because of the Native Americans who were armed there. And so it is interesting that the Americans won the war without after capturing their two biggest objectives, New York in the east and Detroit in the west. But it's also fair to say, I think, as most historians do, that it was Native Americans, not the Patriots, who won the war in the West. The Native Americans didn't lose the war in the West until at the bargaining table when the British sold them out.
Yeah, exactly. I want to look at the front cover of your book. Inside the front cover of the book, on the jacket at the bottom, where usually somebody would, there'd be a caption for that cover. It says, a note on the jacket illustration. The person standing on the left has a secret. Can you spot it? The answer is on pages 402, 403.
Yeah.
You want to get a little spoiler there?
Yeah, let's go ahead and spoil it for the people watching at home. Although you guys can play along. Look at, here, I'll zoom out again. This is the cover, and it's two British, it's actually a zoom in, there were three, but two British couriers being waylaid by an American infantryman with just a pistol, who successfully captured them, and more importantly, their messages. This is during the American siege of Savannah, Georgia. Anyway, the infantryman gets all these important messages and sending them not to the British officer that they were destined for, but for an American officer. But there's something, well, I'll just say this infantryman has a surprise. And I wonder if people can.
Yeah, so if you have an idea what the surprise is, you can put that in the Q&A and we'll see it. I also want to encourage folks to put questions up in the Q&A. And Bob Kosofsky came in right away and says, is it a woman?
Wow, that was quick, Bob. Wow.
And then Catherine Gould says it's a woman, and Dee Andrews says it's a woman. So I think we've got this, people have this nailed.
It's a good thing I didn't offer free copies of the book to whoever guessed it, because you got three mighty quick there. I'm not surprised. I've spoken at the AAS before, and I'm not surprised, but I'm surprised at the speed. You're absolutely right. And this is, we think, a true story. It took place not far from where I'm sitting right now in South Carolina. These two sisters-in-law, both had married guys named Martin, two brothers named Martin, found out about this message and intercepted it. And it was first reported by a male South Carolinian named Robert Mills, but then later by Elizabeth Elliott. And I really want to recommend, not just to the three people who wrote in so quickly, but to everybody. You can download tonight from Hathy Trust or from Google Books the amazing 3-volume history, Women of the American Revolution. And I will tell you, Scott can help me talk to you about that book because he wrote an article about it many years ago in the Journal of Women's History. The author's name was Elizabeth Elliott, and she's not the first woman by any means to write about the American Revolution, but she's the first to focus on women. And as you mentioned that article, Scott, one of the cool things about it, it's not all Abigail Adams and Martha Washington. There's lots of ordinary women like
dozens. She has chapters on dozens of women who are part of the American Revolution, and she did incredible research back in the 1840s to track down their stories.
If you've got time, let me. We can go to questions if you want, but I have a couple of controversial things to say about women's role in the Revolution. If you want,
go for it.
Okay, first, not so controversial is the really crucial role they played in the ranks. That is, there were women with Benedict Arnold when he climbed up the Kennebec River to try to capture Quebec, and they really impressed the men with them for being such hard asses, and in spite of the starvation and freezing and all that, and women saved lives in both armies simply by washing shirts, because after, as Elizabeth Fenn shows, after Washington got the army inoculated against smallpox, their number one killer was typhus. And the number one thing that spreads typhus is lice, and that mostly happens through your shirt. So someone as lowly on the sort of social hierarchy as a laundress, she's saving lives. An undergraduate student of mine named Riley Sutherland worked that out. I think it's a really great point. But here's my controversial things come from actually not from the war itself, but from before the war. One of the main ways, in fact, the most effective thing the colonists did before the shooting started was boycott British merchandise. And women really important to these boycotts, both because they consumed, for instance, at least half the tea, and also replacing the things that were not being imported, for instance, by spinning thread. But here's my little controversies. Hannah Griffiths was a Quaker woman living in Philadelphia, and the men of Philadelphia, as of 1768, when she wrote this, the merchants of Philadelphia were ruining the boycott. They refused to sign on to a boycott of British merchandise aimed at repealing, for instance, the tax on tea. They said, no, this is how we make our money, is by importing stuff from Britain. We're not going to go along with this boycott. And when the Philadelphia merchants refused to boycott, then the New York and Boston merchants said, well, we're not going to do it either because everybody's just going to import their stuff through Philly and we'll lose all our business. And so the Philly merchants were really holding up this whole patriotic act. So Hannah Griffiths wrote this poem and eventually published in the newspaper. And people can follow along with me in the blue box, remembering, of course, that those long S's look like F's, but they're really S's. If the sons so degenerate the blessings despise, let the daughters of liberty nobly arise. And one of the things I worked out for the book was this wasn't just a general thing of, oh, yeah, some men aren't as good as others. This was a specific burn on the Philadelphia merchants, and it contributed to their decision early the next year to go along with non-importation. So the little riff I want to give you here is that there was controversy involved in these boycotts. Yes, the boycotts united the colonists against the crown, but they disunited them some a little bit too. So here are women boycotting. That's a statement about a bunch of women who agreed to boycott the use of tea. But notice the exception they mentioned, sickness accepted, because men and women, but especially women who were in charge of their families' medical care then, in a way that moms tend to be with kids still today, they believed that tea was a way to restore somebody to health. And so, okay, it makes sense to say sickness accepted. But Scott, this is the value of one chronology, because if you put this February 1770 letter in the context of what the men had just said, though, like 10 days before, was no exceptions. We're boycotting tea, no exceptions. And so if you put that in the chronology, and then right below this, the women saying, of course, we're going to make an exception for tea, there's a battle of the sexes going on here. And then one other battle is more regional. One of the ways that women participated in the boycott was by holding spinning bees. And I think one reason that is where they gather together. These spinning wheels are not that heavy. You can carry them a couple miles to your neighbor's house if you're a tough 18th century person. So women would gather to spin. And I think they gathered because spinning was kind of seen as low class, something those rednecks on the frontier did, or that really poor women did. And so in order to get middle class women to do it, they gathered together. And a lot of the newspaper reports are some of the most respectable women in town would do it. And so that's pretty smart on their part to make it a collective effort so people kind of collectively overcome the embarrassment. But in the South, that has a racial dimension. That is that by the 1770s, slavery was seen, spinning was seen as something that slaves did. And the association between spinning and slavery was so great that while we have dozens of reports in northern newspapers of women holding spinning bees, for the South, we have none.
Yeah, that's fascinating, great stuff. Before we turn to our viewers' questions, and please keep sending those questions in, we've got a few and we'll surely get more. Let's talk briefly about your own formation as a historian. You and I both grew up in Virginia in the 1970s during the lingering aftermath of white people's massive resistance to the integration of public schools. And your parents, Linwood and Jinx Holton, who were the governor and first lady of Virginia in the early 70s, pretty famously took you and your sisters to attend the predominantly Black schools in Richmond for which you were zoned. I imagine you've thought about how your own political and educational upbringing helped forge the ways you think about American history to this day.
Yes. Well, the big word in 1970 was integration. And that's certainly what I'm trying to do here, is not just to integrate, as we talked about at the beginning, Native Americans and African Americans, women and men, and so forth, but also to integrate military history with political history and social history. I don't think I'm unique among academic historians in having had a pretty snobby attitude towards military history. And I'm still a little worried, as you point, my book's about 2/3 military history, and I'm not sure it's going to get assigned at Harvard because, military history, that's for the history buffs. But I'm trying to show that the academics, at the same time that I'm trying to show people who may not have realized how important Black history and Native American history are to understanding the Declaration of Independence, for instance, I'm also trying to show the academics that if you really want to see what Native Americans and African Americans are up to, whether it's defending Detroit or helping Benedict Arnold, as Benedict Arnold, one of his secondary missions on the way to Quebec was to kill an Abenaki named Natanis, but it turned out Natanis was on his side and actually left him notes along the way saying, turn right here, and those are the directions that got him there before all of his men starved. So anyway, I feel like there's two kinds of integrating going here: the racial integration that I was so thrilled to experience as a kid, having gone to segregated. I don't feel like I'm that old, and I look at you, and you definitely aren't old. I don't feel, and yet you and I grew up, I assume you two, in elementary schools that were absolutely segregated. And so it was a shock at first to be a minority for once, but it was such a great education in itself. I was living in the governor's mansion, which if you put it on the market would sell for $20 million or whatever. And my friends were living in hovels. Literally, some of these guys I would describe, we'd go over to throw water balloons or whatever. And so it was like visiting somebody on Mars for them to come to my house or for me to go to theirs. But that was a tremendous education. And I'm sorry to see now there's sort of a political movement to shield white kids from books like Ruby Goes to School, which is the story of the little girl, sure, famous from the Norman Rockwell painting, who integrated the New Orleans schools. I read about the controversy on the internet, and so I ordered the book. It is the sweetest, most positive book. Nothing against white people. White people, if anything, get too much play as the nice white teacher who helped her, and the white kids who took a while to become her friends, but became her friends. That my experience of racial integration was extremely positive, as I think it was for Ruby Bridges ultimately. And so, I feel like I was affected that. But we were talking about this on email before. For me, that was only a seed, because then along comes Peter Wood at Duke, who generated this whole series, several generations worth of historians interested in social history. And not everybody watching tonight knows what you and I know, that two Peter Wood students, one of whom he shared with another of his students, Julia Scott, but two Peter Wood students, Vincent Brown and Marjolaine Kars, were just announced as the co-winners of the Frederick Douglass Prize for their recent books about slave revolts in the Caribbean, in Berbice.
I'll just put in a shameless plug there, because we did an AAS program with them about those two books back in June. So if you're interested in those books, you can go to our YouTube channel and hear them talking about them. I'm
interested in winning the Frederick Douglass Prize, and I assume now that I've been in an AAS program too, I can count on that as well, Scott.
I'm going to turn to some of the questions. And our president emerita of AAS, Ellen Dunlap, says, "Hi, Woody."
Hi, Ellen. Hey, Ellen.
And this connects to what we were just talking about. Ellen asks, how long has the seed of this book been germinating in your head? And was there anything in particular that prompted you to bring it to fruition now?
Well, there are lots of clever references to the Trump era in there, but I can't call this a response to closing borders or any of that stuff because I've been working on it for 12 years. The short answer to that question is I thought of this when I was at the AAS, when Ellen Dunlap was the president of AAS and casting around such good ideas. And there's a little bit of truth to that because my first book was about Virginia, and being at the AAS broadened me to look beyond Virginia. And I've long had this idea of trying to write this integrated history. And by the way, there are other great books that do something similar to what I do, for instance, by Gary Nash, who we just lost, or Alan Taylor. And that book is only about 5 years old. Yeah. And Alan's book does a lot on the west of the Mississippi region that I don't cover. But the one niche that was left for me was the one you mentioned at the very beginning, and that is to really integrate them. But Ellen will understand my other answer to her question. The real germination of this was very late in life. I got married and had a couple of kids, and I didn't want to be gone from Beverly and Henry. Now they're teenagers, and I don't mind. They like it when I'm gone. But when I was young, and so I tried to design a project that I could do mostly from printed primary sources. That's the number one source. The single biggest one is one I recommend to people watching if they haven't already heard of it. Just Google Founders Online, and it's everything written to or from Washington, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, Adams, and so forth. And it's not just something you use for great man history, because most of the people I just mentioned were enslavers, and you can learn a lot about the people they enslaved. So, for instance, my phrase "liberty is sweet" comes most directly from an article that my mentor Peter Wood wrote, but he got it from a letter written to George Washington describing African Americans at Mount Vernon, saying, "Oh yeah, Washington himself is off fighting the British. This may be our opportunity to get our own liberty, and liberty is sweet."
Yeah, and we have a question picking up on African Americans and the Revolution. Catherine Kowaloff says, if the colonies weren't rebelling, there wouldn't be a need for extra Black soldiers. So why would the threat of a slave or British alliance convince a colonist to lean toward independence?
Right. This is a great point. And by the way, we have the sort of counter example, or you might call it in chemistry terms, the control group in the Caribbean, where 90% of those British colonies were enslaved, and they did not rebel against Britain. And lots of reasons, but if you had to choose the biggest, you would say that they were 90% enslaved and they feared that they'd be starting a slave revolt. But I think the white colonists, well, the most important thing I think I want to say in response to that is you've got to see the revolution as evolving in stages. That is, the first stage from 1762 to 1774, the colonists are only playing defense. Remember, I called that Parliament's rebellion. It's Parliament that wants to change the status quo. So all the colonists are doing, I mean, they're doing violent things. People get killed in the battle over the Liberty Pole in New York, for instance, and of course, in the Boston Massacre. There's violence going on, but the colonists are none of them want to declare independence. It's only after the British, in suppressing colonial protests, do things like close the port of Boston, change the charter of Massachusetts, those are the so-called coercive acts, hand over the Ohio Valley to Quebec, and things like that. And then much more drastically start bringing in mercenaries, soldiers from the Germanys, and forming these alliances with Native Americans and African Americans. It's only at that late stage that the colonists want to declare independence. I think the question is really good, because if the colonists could have looked from the beginning to the end and seen what things, or if Parliament could have seen which way things were going to go, it probably wouldn't have done these initiatives. But people don't respond to what's going to happen in 12 years. They respond to what's in front of them. And so you get this series of stages that put the British in a position where they feel like they've got to make this appeal to enslaved people. They got to bring in the Germans. They got to bring in Native Americans. And then in response to that, the colonists do something they'd never wanted to do before, which was declare independence. In response to that and other things like common sense and so forth.
Yeah. We have several questions about the maps. One question is just a basic question: are the maps you showed in your book? And the other, and that's probably a yes or no question, but another one is a comment, really. Professor Carol Bork-James of Vanderbilt University has uncovered a map made by Canadians that shows all the Indian villages densely straddling the border around the Great Lakes. It's interesting that nearly all American maps do not include these villages. That harks back to something we were talking about with William Hart and David Silverman last week or a week before, about how we can't really look. We have to look carefully at the maps we often show of the American Revolutionary period, because they don't show the Indian villages, the Native American tribes at all. They're just showing the colonies.
Yes. So let me answer the first part of that question real quick first. That cantonments map, where I put the blue star for Detroit, yes, that's in the book. The map of the siege of Savannah, I think that's from a book by an author named Wilson, and the book is called Southern Strategy. But you can find, just Google Savannah, December 1778, and you can do a Google image search and find that. But on the much more important question, in my opinion, of showing Native communities
Yes.
and borders, I do that. I hired, really, I think, the best map maker in the business, whose name I'm forgetting. So there it is, Jeff Ward.
That's great.
But you see, he's got the borders of the colonies, but also the borders among Native societies. And of course, on a 2-page map like this, you can't represent every town of any significance, but I do have at least a couple of towns for all of the colonies, for all the major colonies, and for all the major Native nations as well. And so I'll have to go back and see my friend Dan Silverman's take on this, but it sounds like we have a similar one. Natives at the time of the Revolution did have borders. Now, they often contested them, and if I could have zoomed in, you would have seen in Kentucky, that's very much a dark and bloody ground, as the Cherokee dragging canoe called it, because nations south of the Ohio River claimed it, like the Cherokees, but so did a lot of nations north of the river, and they were constantly fighting over it. And that's one of the amazing things about that coalition that these female peace chiefs organized in 1769, was that coalition, unlike Pontiac's, crossed the Ohio River. That is, it united these nations who'd been fighting over Kentucky and people and all sorts of other things too. So I really appreciate the question about maps.
Yeah, we've got several questions here about the Loyalists. One person asks, this is Don Dupre asks, does your book discuss the role of the Loyalists, as H.W. Brands' book does? And Sean Thompson asks, could you speak of how the revolution could also be seen as a civil war between the aspirant Whigs/Patriots and the Anglo-aristocratic Loyalists/Tories? How does this figure into the remembrance of the contributions of regional militias versus Washington's Continental Army? So.
Okay, we have a bunch of great issues about
a lot of great questions here. Yeah.
Yeah, they sure are. So yes, Loyalists definitely play a huge role in my book. And I think it is correct to call the only thing I would change about, do we call it a civil war? The only thing I would change is add an S. It's a series of civil wars. One of the great things that Alan Taylor does in his book on the Revolution, it's American revolutions, plural, because it seems like almost everybody's rebelling against somebody else. And many people are both being rebelled against while rebelling against somebody else. And this is a civil war not only between white patriots and loyalists, but you have African Americans on both sides as well. And so, for instance, I mentioned those two black guys advising Lafayette. One had been sent by Cornwallis, so he's clearly on the British side. He's the one who led the Americans into a trap. And in fact, I can't resist saying that the last battle in which Continental soldiers died in 1782 was very similar, in that a black guy came and said, oh, there's a bunch of really vulnerable British guys here, come and get them. and the Americans came and got them and got themselves. Some 5 Continental soldiers died. So anyway, you have lots of African Americans fighting for the British, lots fighting for the American, and so it's fair to call this an African American Civil War as well, because if you wanted to get free, you signed up for whoever was offering freedom, and that put you in conflict sometimes with other African Americans. And of course, that'd be true for Native Americans as well, because there were natives on both sides. And even within the famous Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, of those 6 nations, basically 1.5, the Oneidas and half the Tuscaroras, went with the Patriots, and the rest went with the British. And you did have, for a brief period, especially around the Battle of Oriskany in August of 1777, you had Iroquois fighting and killing other Iroquois. They managed to restrain themselves pretty much after that. But so it's a series of civil wars. I want to talk about the memory thing, because I remember being struck, even before I really decided in grad school to focus on the Revolution, how well the Loyalists do in James Fenimore Cooper's novel.
Yeah.
They're not all bad guys in there
Right.
by any means. And you could say this, I know you haven't been reading Elizabeth Elliot in a long time, but that's true in her work as well, right?
Yeah.
She's sort of more pro-woman than pro-patriot. That is, often yes, a loyalist woman will get off a cool one-liner or burn against a Continental officer. I remember Rebecca Franks at one point, the guy, he says, "Oh, look, that lady's wearing a British-style hairdo," and she said, "Yeah, but look at the rags he's wearing. That's a Continental uniform." And good burn, Rebecca. And I just think that's cool that Elizabeth Elliot is cheering for the Loyalists. You can understand it a little bit more with Cooper, because a lot of his family had been Loyalists. But right, Michael Kamen has a theory that a student of mine was just telling me about, and I have to go back to Kamen's book myself, and says in the early 19th century, when working people are sort of rising up and starting unions and things like that, and they're appropriating, as Sean Willents talks about, the rhetoric of the American Revolution, this revolution starts to not look so good in the eyes of the elite of the 19th century, and the Loyalists, who had stood for order, start to look not so bad. And I think that's one reason they came off okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna end with 2 more questions that we have from viewers. We've got a bunch, but I'm gonna go with 2. The first one takes us past the revolution and really asks the question about what happens to these groups after. Jean Prochnow says, "It appears from your work that most Blacks, Native Americans, and women did not benefit from the revolution. Is that an accurate summation?"
Certainly accurate for Native Americans. I think it'd be hard to find anyone who studied the revolution who thinks that it was a net gain for Native Americans. A few, but did better, but almost all, so it's a total loss for Native Americans. African Americans, it's split. There are amazing stories of, for instance, the 3,000 African Americans who sailed out of New York Harbor, and I imagine them sailing past the future site of the Statue of Liberty, but they're sailing away from America to freedom in 1783, 100 years before the Statue of Liberty went up, settling in Nova Scotia, where they were badly mistreated by their fellow Loyalists, that is, the white Loyalists, so badly that they later, 1,200 of them later accepted an offer to settle in the new British colony of Sierra Leone. And we know of one guy who made it back to his homeland. Most African Americans by that time were America born, but this guy was African born, and he completed the circuit and appeared among his people as though back from the dead, But so anecdotally, people live in anecdotes, they don't live in statistics. Anecdotally, there are amazing, cool stories of African Americans who got free by fighting for the British or by fighting for the Americans. A lot of people know that Rhode Island had a whole regiment that was mostly African Americans, a few Native Americans and whites in it. And it is also true that during the Revolution, most of the New England states, or all of the New England states, at least put slavery on the road to extinction. It was a slow road in Connecticut and Rhode Island, but they at least got things started. So, and yet, for instance, I mentioned Governor Dunmore. Of the hundreds of African Americans who joined him, the majority died of disease. It's one thing we haven't had time to talk about tonight, but I do talk a lot about in the book is the incredible impact, even after the inoculation of against smallpox, that disease had throughout the war. And so many African Americans ended up worse than before. Women, we're talking just about free white women. I'm going to give out my email address because great classes are almost over. Holton@sc.edu. I'd love to hear other people's opinions because here's mine. I think free white women like Abigail Adams got very little out of the revolution. She famously wrote, John, remember the ladies, but they didn't. Now, they found ways to get something out of it. She ended up making a bunch of money and declaring it her own in defiance of the English common law, which continued to prevail in America after the revolution. But my next book, where I'm not so concerned about going to archives and eager to go to places like the AAS, is going to be on disease in the revolution. And my preliminary glances at that indicate that nearly as many women died of disease as a result of the Revolutionary War as the number of men who died from bullets. About 7,000 men were shot dead in the American Revolution, fewer than died in 3 days at Gettysburg. Now, another 24,000 men died of disease, and it looks like somewhere between 7,000 and 24,000 women died of diseases stirred up and carried around by the armies circulating through the colonies during the Revolutionary War. And so, at least in the short term, you have to say a negative. Although if you go as far forward as 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention, how did they begin their document, the Declaration of Sentiments? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal.
Yeah. Which in a way brings us right around to the last question, which is from D. Andrews, who says, I'm thoroughly enjoying Professor Holton's talk. Here's the inevitable question about the 1619 Project and related issues, which of course we could talk about for an hour, but we're not going to do that for an hour. We're going to do it for just a few minutes. Are you concerned that looking at all sides of the revolution may leave the, quote, American story, so to speak, in the hands of people unfriendly to your perspective and those of the New York Times Project? Gary Nash had some of these difficulties in his diversifying the American Revolution, so that one of his Canadian critics joked that the real democratic revolution was in Canada. And here's the question that Dee ends with that I think is a great way to end our conversation. Is there a way to diversify, but also empower the legacy of the revolution?
There absolutely is, but it's going to cause me to steal your screen one more time right here at the end of our talk. And that is diversify. To diversify is to empower. Cassandra Good is professor down at Marymount University in Virginia. And she when I was getting ready to debate Gordon Wood about, it turned out to be a lot about the 1619 Project. That was one of her big questions for him is people like him are saying, we need the founders to unite around. And she goes, if you're only going to make the founders white men and mostly slaveholders, how do you expect women and African Americans and other Americans to unite around them? And my response to those who oppose the 1619 Project is it's not a matter of uniting in spite of our diversity. We can unite around our diversity. And this last slide will make the point. This is Lemuel Haynes, who fought on the American side of the Revolutionary War. And in 1776, he had just completed a pamphlet. You might be able to make out at the top left there, Liberty Further Extended. It's an anti-slavery pamphlet. And he just completed it when he got a copy of the Declaration of Independence. And so what did he use as his epigraph? You might be able to see this right below his name by Lemuel Haynes. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Thus, this man of mixed race, white mom, black dad, became the very first person ever to quote the Declaration of Independence. And Eric Slaughter at Chicago determined that, in fact, 70% of the people who quoted created equal during the 18th century, that is up until 1799, 70% of the people who quoted it were abolitionists, both black ones like Lemuel Haynes and Benjamin Banneker, and white ones. And they did something really important by that, because the Declaration of Independence when Congress wrote it, was about secession. These 13 parts of the British Empire have the right to secede from the rest of the British Empire. That was a collective right. It has to do with states and territories and countries. And they really hadn't emphasized. They had said what Jefferson said, all men are created equal, but no one quoted that hardly. Who did quote that were abolitionists, and later, as I did just a minute ago, women's rights advocates. And by doing that, African American and white abolitionists, and then male and female women's rights advocates, turned this secession document into a universal declaration of human rights. And so I got to convince my friend Gordon Wood, we're not going to unite around the slaveholders, but we can unite around some of the things they wrote down, like all men are created equal. And that's I think ultimately, if people are willing to fight, and people are going to have to go to school board meetings, because people who want to suppress Ruby Bridges goes to school, and the story of Lemuel Haynes and the story of Governor Dunmore and the African Americans who initiated an alliance with them, they're going to the school boards and they're yelling at school boards, and the school boards are listening because they don't like to be yelled at. And I'm not urging anybody here to go yell at anybody, but we need to go there too, and fight for the truth of American history, because that truth is more inspiring than the cardboard version that we're taught back in school.
Woody, this has been just fabulous. I want to thank you for this conversation for the last hour. I want to thank everybody who's been watching. Almost 200 people were watching us tonight. If you'd like to recommend this program to friends, our public programs are all available on the AAS YouTube channel. And I want, as we close, to encourage you to check out our upcoming programs, which are listed on the AAS website. This Thursday at 2:00, Mark Rivkin is going to talk about his recent book, Speaking for the People, Native Writing and the Question of Political Form. That's part of our History of the Book in America monthly book talks. And next Thursday night, December 9th at 7:00, I'll be talking with Georgia Barnhill, who's the longtime curator of graphic arts right here at the American Antiquarian Society, about her forthcoming book, Gems of Art on Paper, which is about early American book illustration. So I hope you'll join us. Woody, thank you so much.
Tell Gigi I said hi. Thank you, Scott. This was great.
Thanks. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a great evening and good night.